In our timeline, the Renaissance was an age of awakening, an explosion of art, philosophy, and humanism that painted the world with light and genius. But in another 1482, the awakening was of a different kind. It wasn't the whisper of a muse, but the cold, rhythmic click of a gear tooth locking into place. In this timeline, the Renaissance didn't just paint the world, it wound it up and set it loose. The point of Divergence is not a battle or a treaty, but a meeting between the boundless mind of Leonardo da Vinci and the ruthless ambition of a patron who saw not beauty in his designs, but a blueprint for domination. That patron was Cesare Borgia, a man who sought to carve a kingdom from the heart of Italy with iron and blood. He gave Leonardo not just patronage, but a blank check and a new kind of workshop, a proto-factory shielded from the prying eyes of the church and rival states. Leonardo, promised the freedom to create without limit, began with his testudo, the armored car. In our world, it was a flight of fancy. Here, it was a funded project. For months, the workshop hammered and sawed. They forged iron plates and, most critically, learned the new art of tempering massive springs, each one capable of storing the energy of 20 men. This was not craftsmanship. This was the birth of an industry. Traditional generals scoffed. They called it Borgia's folly, a clumsy toy that would bog down in the mud. They placed their faith in the condottieri, the mercenary captains, with their proven tactics of pike and sword. They were wrong. The Battle of Forli was not a battle. It was an extermination. The machine, powered by 8 men furiously turning cranks within its belly, plowed through the mercenary lines. It was impervious to arrows, to swords, to fear. It was the physical manifestation of a new and terrible logic on the battlefield. By nightfall, Borgia's folly had a new name. They called it the Annihilator. Whispers of the Iron Beast spread through Italy like a plague, carried by the few terrified survivors. The arms race had just begun. But to understand how this single invention turned all of Europe into a continent of ticking time bombs, we must first trace the path of the stolen blueprints. The success of the testudo ignited a firestorm of paranoia and ambition. Milan and Venice, the great powers of northern Italy, knew they had to adapt or be consumed. They dispatched spies, not to steal military plans, but to steal ideas, to poach Leonardo's apprentices, to acquire the new knowledge of gear cutting and spring tempering. A new kind of war was being fought in the shadows, an industrial espionage campaign in the heart of the 15th century. The cities themselves began to transform. In Florence, the beautiful piazzas were sometimes cleared to allow for the passage of new, wide-axle clockwork cranes used to construct Brunelleschi's dome faster than ever thought possible. The air, once filled with the scent of cypress and baking bread, now carried a metallic tang. The gentle peal of church bells was now punctuated by the rhythmic, percussive clang of 1,000 hammers in the growing artificers' district. A new class of citizen was born, the artificer. These master engineers and mechanics, once seen as mere craftsmen, now held the keys to power. The Artificers' Guild grew to rival the influence of the bankers and the clergy. Their knowledge was a state secret, their skills a weapon. This created a violent social schism. Traditional weavers, stonemasons, and scribes found themselves displaced by tireless machines that could do their work faster and cheaper. This was a gilded age, but also a gilded cage. The technology of war was now seeping into every facet of life, creating efficiencies at the cost of humanity. And, at the center of it all, was Leonardo. He was celebrated, showered with wealth, but he was a prisoner. Borgia, his patron, demanded ever more ingenious, ever more lethal creations. The giant crossbow, the scythed chariot, a clockwork beast that could crawl up fortress walls. The artist in him was horrified by the monster he had fed. The engineer was trapped by the challenge of his own intellect. In secret, by candlelight, he began to work on a different kind of project. Not a weapon of control, but a machine of escape. A refined, elegant design for his ornithopter. A way to fly above the smoke-choked cities, to leave the grinding of the gears behind. He saw it as his salvation. He could not have known he was designing the world's first true terror weapon. This single obsession with flight, born of desperation, would have a terrifying, unforeseen consequence that would reshape the very concept of borders and nations. The year is 1494. The French army, a magnificent force of chivalric knights and disciplined infantry, thunders into Italy. In our history, their invasion destabilized the peninsula for decades. In this timeline, they were marching into a meat grinder. The French cavalry, the pride of Europe, charged. They were not met by pikemen, but by a volley of giant steel bolts from dozens of Leonardo's great crossbows, each one reloaded and retensioned by a massive clockwork engine. The bolts punched through knights and their mounts with equal ease. The charge faltered, dissolving into chaos. Then, from the flanks, came the scythed chariots, their whirling blades a blur of mechanical death. The French invasion was shattered in a single afternoon. The shockwave was felt across the continent. England, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, they all understood. Their armies were obsolete. The race for the machina was no longer an Italian affair. It was a European imperative. A new, frantic era of innovation began, not in art, but in armament. The continent became a laboratory for mechanized warfare. The English developed brutish, heavily armored walkers, powered by immense, slow-turning gears. The Spanish, influenced by Moorish design, created intricate, almost delicate assassination automatons. The German states of the HRE focused on mass production, churning out standardized, ruthlessly efficient clockwork infantry. This technological leap fueled a more aggressive age of exploration. Ships were outfitted with complex navigational clocks and automated pumps, allowing them to travel farther and faster. When they arrived in the New World, the disparity was no longer one of steel against stone. It was a chasm between muscle and machine. The Aztec and Incan empires were not conquered. They were dismantled by terrifying clockwork gods that descended from the sea. Back in Europe, the human cost was immeasurable. The relentless noise of the manufactories, the toxic smoke from the forges, the sheer psychological dread of living under the shadow of these ever-present machines began to grind away at the human spirit. The vibrant optimism of the early Renaissance was a distant memory, replaced by a grim, metallic pragmatism. And then, Leonardo made his move. On a stormy night in 1502, he did the impossible. He flew. He escaped his gilded cage, soaring into the turbulent skies. But he wasn't just fleeing for his life. Strapped to his back was a leather folio containing his most recent, most secret designs. These were not weapons. They were something else entirely. Something that could save the world from the path he had set it on, or accelerate its descent into oblivion. But to understand what was in that folio, and how it led to the silent century, we must first understand the one material Leonardo had just discovered, a way to create springs with a previously unimaginable tensile strength. Leonardo's escape created a power vacuum, not of politics, but of genius. His designs, now scattered among rival powers through espionage and theft, were copied and misinterpreted by lesser minds. Without their creator's vision, and, crucially, his restraint, the evolution of the machina took a monstrous turn. Artificers, driven by the demands of paranoid kings, focused only on scale and destructive power. The clockwork wars engulfed Europe. It was a new kind of total war, fought not for territory but for resources, for the specific iron ore needed for plating, the old-growth hardwood for chassis, and above all, for the secret alloys required for the high-tension springs, the very heart of every machine. The continent became a chessboard for lumbering, city-breaking automata. The art of strategy was replaced by a grim contest of industrial output, and this led to the great, unforeseen consequence. The core flaw in this clockwork world, the entire technological ecosystem, from the smallest automated loom to the largest walking fortress, was dependent on the energy stored in those colossal springs. The specific blend of charcoal and rare metals needed to create them was finite, and they had plundered the earth to get it. The great unwinding began not with a bang, but with a slow, agonizing groan. A colossus on the German front would wind down in the middle of a siege, becoming a permanent, useless iron mountain. A factory's mainspring would snap, silencing hundreds of machines in an instant. The ticking that had become the continent's heartbeat began to slow. Armies literally ground to a halt. The supply chains of hyper-tempered steel collapsed. The power source of their civilization was gone. The society built upon the machine collapsed with it. The intricate knowledge of the artificers was lost, as the guilds dissolved into starvation and chaos. Europe, having technologically advanced itself at a dizzying pace, fell into a new, more terrible dark age. It was a dark age, littered with the sophisticated corpses of its own hubris. The Renaissance, the age of light and beauty, was a forgotten myth. A ghost story whispered by the starving descendants of engineers. The silence is absolute. For the first time in a century, the only sound is the wind. A testament to the terrifying truth that the most brilliant mind can forge not only the keys to a golden age, but also the gears of its destruction. The timeline is always in flux, a delicate mechanism that can be broken by a single, revolutionary idea. The timeline is ever shifting. To explore more worlds that never were, and futures that might yet be, subscribe to ChronoShift.